Last month, a rare moment of congressional bipartisanship saw the broad reset of changes to federal criminal statutes in a generation. But while the groundbreaking criminal justice reform has been hailed by both sides of the aisle, our next guest writes that the system is still geared to ensure failure. At the age of 17, Chris Wilson shot and killed one of two men who cornered him one night. A year later, he was sentenced to life in prison. Behind bars, Chris dedicated his time to turning his life around, and he tells the story of his journey in the new book, The Master Plan, My Journey from Life in Prison to a Life of Purpose. And Chris joins us now. It's so great to meet you. Thanks for being here, Chris.
Thanks for having me.
You know, your story is incredible, and before we get to what you're advocating for here, I just want to make sure people understand your life a little bit. You grew up in Washington, D.C. in the late 80s, early 90s, in the thick of the cocaine epidemic.
Yes.
Talk, if you would, just a bit, Chris, about the night that has shaped your life since.
I remember it was about 24 years ago, and I was walking to the store and some men were following me, and I remember them threatening me and surrounding me, and I had a gun on me. I was carrying a gun for protection, and I ended up taking a person's life that night.
How old were you then, Chris?
I was 17.
And also you lost your father that same night?
Well, I lost my father 2 months after that.
2 months after.
While I was in jail. They charged me as an adult, so my father was killed while I was awaiting trial.
So you were given life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Well, I had the possibility of parole, but in the state of Maryland, you don't get parole when you get sentenced to life.
Right. So what changed then? How did you find your way out of prison, and what did you learn while you were in?
Well, I always knew in my heart that I was a good person, and around this time when I was sentenced, I wanted to prove to myself and prove to the world that my life was redeemable. And so it was around this time that I wrote up the master plan and was the pledge to turn my life around, but also help other people do the same.
And so what did you say to a parole board? How did you convince them that life in prison was not what you needed?
Well, I had to demonstrate it through my actions. And so the first thing I did was I wanted to educate myself, a high school diploma, a college degree, and went through many years of therapy just to show that my life was salvageable. And
so what do you say to people when they ask you what the master plan is? What is that exactly?
So the master plan is essentially about someone who thinks about how they want to be remembered when they're gone, about what they want to do with their life and how they want to make the world a little better. And then there's like steps of what you do to how you get there.
And one of the things you mentioned is that you had to keep updating this master plan. It's a process. And just to kind of transition into one of the things we want to talk about today is the reform of criminal justice.
Yes.
We are at one step in our master plan, perhaps. What other steps do you see us taking going forward?
So that's a good question. And so even with the latest legislation that was passed, which is great, but it's also that legislation was passed at a federal level, and most of the people that are suffering in the criminal justice system are on the state level. And so I think there's a lot of work that we have to implement, especially solitary confinement. Men and women and children are still being subjected to that on the state level, and that's one issue that we need to address.
So the U.S. It leads in the world as the top jailer of their own people, and there's also a really just devastating racial divide in who's incarcerated. You have 1 in 87 white men are incarcerated, 1 in 36 Hispanic men are incarcerated, 1 in 12 black men are incarcerated, and there is just a cruel way of the way we treat our system and the way we treat our people who are incarcerated. I wanted to ask you, what can we do in our community for young people like you who went through everything who are going through something similar that you're going through? Like, what do you, when you see them out in Baltimore, or you see young folks, what do you tell them?
Well, the first thing I do is I try to operate and lead as a positive example, but some things that people can do is vote. Like, pay attention to legislation that people are trying to pass, and call your local representatives, or just find someone in your community and pay some extra time and helping and mentoring them and showing them there's a better way to live. And
this isn't just theoretical for you, you're living it. Tell me about the Barclay Investment Corporation you started.
So I started a construction contracting company out of frustration. I was doing workforce development, and many people who had made mistakes 20 years ago, employers wouldn't hire them. And so out of frustration, I decided to start this contracting company and give men and women an opportunity to work.
Good for you, and good for you writing this book. I think a lot of people will draw inspiration from it. It's called The Master Plan, My Journey from Life in Prison to a Life of Purpose. Chris Wilson, great to meet you. Thanks for being
Thank
here.
you. Thanks for having me.
Coming up on Morning Joe, we'll talk about the winners and the losers after Amazon decides to do away with its plan for a headquarters in New York City. Plus, President Trump set to fly off to Mar-a-Lago today after declaring a national emergency in just a couple of hours. Morning Joe's coming right back. Great job.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.